Hi, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I am a rose farmer here on the west coast of Canada, and I want to talk today about using alfalfa as a fertilizer. For this conversation, I brought in April. She is working for Western Alfalfa Milling, which I'm given to believe has something like 20,000 acres of alfalfa farmed. That's a huge amount. So I'm assuming she knows a little bit about alfalfa. What's more, and gives her special use in this conversation is that they specifically mill their alfalfa and market their alfalfa for use as a fertilizer, both for agriculture and for gardens. Thanks so much for coming and talking to me today. There's a lot that we need to know about alfalfa as a fertilizer.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, no problem at all. I've been looking forward to picking your brain on the topic here. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is nitrogen. It's kind of got a special place as fertilizers here. And I would just want to give the viewers a bit of a background on this, is that nitrogen doesn't stick around long in the soil, unlike phosphorus, which just kind of sticks in the soil and stays there for a long, long time. If you were to apply nitrogen as, and you may correct me on some of this science stuff, but if you were to apply nitrogen in the nitrate form, like they do in many fertilizers, it's water soluble and it can just rinse right through in a matter of months or years. If you were to apply it in ammonia form, it wants to volatilize and go up into the atmosphere. So getting nitrogen to stick around is a bit of a concern, and plants use lots of nitrogen. So between plants needing lots of it and it not sticking around for very long, it is one of the nutrients that is routinely deficient or limiting for farms and gardens. Am I getting that about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. So the alfalfa naturally contains nitrogen. The plant itself has nodules that convert nitrogen from the air into what the plant needs as it's growing. And that enables the leafy material or the flowers in the plant to be harvested and take that nitrogen and use it for other uses. When we talk about alfalfa pellets as animal feed, we're referring to nitrogen as protein. Nitrogen and protein are two different names for the same thing. So everything that alfalfa does to feed everything alfalfa does to feed the animals, it also does to feed the soil and the plants in the form of nitrogen and other nutrients.
Right. So if we were to talk, and we gardeners are used to talking about things in terms of NPK, if we were looking at alfalfa as an NPK source, we'd see it as relatively high in nitrogen, relatively low in phosphorus, and sort of, I could say, low to moderate in terms of potassium, which strangely enough matches the nutritional needs of many plants. I was looking into roses a while back, and again, high nitrogen, lower phosphorus needs. It does need phosphorus, but in lower amounts, and then a relatively higher amount of potassium as well. So, sorry, just going back one step in the science here, and you mentioned fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. That's something that alfalfa can do. And, you know, the atmosphere is like high amounts of nitrogen. So most garden plants can't do that. So that is the thing about the legume crops like alfalfa, like clover in your lawn, that it can actually pull in that nitrogen and use it for its own purposes, which makes it kind of an interesting proposition to grow all that alfalfa, mill it, and then apply it to your gardens, because it was able to fix that nitrogen, whereas other plants aren't able to do that. That's sort of the concept.
That's exactly how it works. Yes. Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch quickly on the question of sustainability, because you don't get agriculture, you don't get farming without some amount of inputs, and those inputs all have, you know, impacts on the environment. It just intuitively to me seems that using a chemical process to make nitrates or ammonias and apply that fertilizer to the soil has maybe a higher level of impact than applying alfalfa. I'm going to ask you, because you're the expert on that, sort of how does alfalfa land on that in terms of sustainability?
Well, alfalfa is a pretty amazing plant. It's extremely hardy. It grows very well in the Canadian prairies, specifically where I'm located on East Central Saskatchewan. The alfalfa grows on our farming in organic production. So everything that we have in alfalfa fields is designated to become certified organic, with the intention that would go to either certified organic feed or as part of our fertilizer program. So that means that we don't apply anything, no fertilizers, or no chemical fertilizers, no herbicides, no pesticides, nothing on our acres.
So now, in terms of the difference between, again, those chemical fertilizers, chemical nitrogen applications, and applying alfalfa, what does alfalfa then also do for the soil? Because we're always told that chemical fertilizer, while it may supply the needs of the plant, it really doesn't do a lot for the soil. But I would imagine that something organic like alfalfa has some other positive impacts.
So using chemical or synthetic fertilizers tends to act like giving sugar to someone. It is an immediate feed for the plants, but it does nothing as a long-term sustainability to increase the actual health of the plant, or more importantly, the health of the soil. By adding alfalfa, you're introducing not just nitrogen, not just the NPK, but also up to another 30 macro, micro minerals, nutrients, amino acids, everything that the soil needs for what nature intended. So what you're basically doing is you're feeding the microbes, and the microbes are then in turn converting all those nutrients in the soil into plant available products, and the plants will absorb what they need as they need it.
Great, and all the attendant improvements in soil structure and water retention and everything else as well. So I think overall, I think it sounds like a great solution. How much do you apply? Now, I was looking at your website, I have to say, and when we start talking about a standard application, we're going to trip over this a little bit because we're talking to people in Canada, but we're talking to people in the US too. So some of us are going to talk in metric, and some of us are going to talk in square feet. But luckily, we Canadians are somewhat bilingual in that matter. So oftentimes in the US, they talk in terms of pounds per 1,000 square feet, which we would call 93 square meters, for instance. So pounds per 1,000 square feet. I looked on your website and it said something like 50 pounds or 52 pounds per 1,000 square feet was a pretty good application of alfalfa. But you can actually, on the calculator on your website, you can say, well, I don't have 1,000 square feet, I have 100 square feet. So how many pounds? And it'll help you to convert that down. So 100 square feet would be like 5 pounds. Or if I'm talking about a rose, which I'm considering about 10 square feet, instead of 5 pounds, it might be half a pound or something along those lines there. Does that sound about right?
That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. And for any plants that are heavy feeders, like roses, and many vegetables that we grow, and other flowers too, of course, you never have to worry about over applying. The alfalfa is not going to burn the plants or the tender roots at any stage. And we actually recommend for heavy feeders to put an application of alfalfa pellets down every 4 to 6 weeks. Okay. These can be applied as a top dressing, just sprinkled around the like under the weed line of the plant, or it could be applied by adding or brewing some alfalfa tea, or just worked into the soil on the sides. And
right now,
the alfalfa will work its way down.
Awesome. So now it does take a little bit of time to become available to the plants in the soil. So probably to some degree, earlier the better in the season. If I were doing my roses, for instance, if I'm pruning them, that's the time they're waking up. That's when I would hit them with their alfalfa application, just to start feeding them for the season. Now, in terms of how to apply, I get some questions. So I have some questions to throw at you here for my audience, because I've recommended alfalfa in the past, and some of them say, well, hang on, I live in a very, very dry climate. If I put alfalfa on the top of my soil, it's just going to sit there and form a crust. It's never, ever going to incorporate into the soil. So what solutions can you sort of recommend for that in the garden situation?
Well, basically, first of all, you would never need to put down enough that it would actually form a crust. That if that's heavier than what any of the recommendations would be as a general fertilizer for the plants. other than that, if it's possible to sprinkle and then use either a hand rake or a garden rake or even a hoe and just gently stir the pellets into that little bit of a top layer of soil, any moisture that you are watering your plants will get absorbed and the pellets will break down and work their way down into the soil.
Okay, so apply with moisture and work it into the top layer of the soil. Makes a lot of sense. I've often seen some gardeners recommend even pre-soaking the pellets quickly and getting them wet and then applying them in, working them into that top layer of the soil.
Yes.
So that all makes a lot of sense. Now, the other question is about rodents. People talk about, well, boy, my mice would go after the alfalfa pellets or so on. I mean, alfalfa is known as a feed for things like rabbits and so on. I personally, and I'm going to say, don't have that problem in my garden because it breaks down so quickly. And so one thing I want to ask you about is quickly, you offer it in a little pellet. It's much smaller than what you'd see in those sort of like cubes that you find as animal feed. These are tiny little prills or meal that you'd apply to your garden. So I can't imagine that sticking around so long that rodents would find it very interesting, especially once it gets wet and mushy.
That's what we found as well. And any of the feedback or any of our own experiences are that as soon as the pellets absorb any kind of moisture, there's no interest by animals, deer, rabbits, any type of critters. And the small pellets do break down a lot faster. It takes a lot less moisture around them for them to break down. They also provide a more even coverage when you're blending them into the soil, a better distribution. The little pellets are made with a 4mm die, or for our American friends, 5/32. So they're quite tiny. They're more slightly larger than maybe a peppercorn. And that does allow them to break down very quickly. It allows them to be easily applied through any type of rotary fertilizer spreader. And it eliminates the dust. There's a lot of interest in alfalfa meal that we see people talking about on the internet, that alfalfa meal is the thing to use. We process both here at the mill, alfalfa pellets and alfalfa meal. In my opinion, the alfalfa pellets are much easier to use. They're less dusty, and they break down just as quick.
Okay, so I have to probe you on one other thing here. I've been talking a little bit on my channel about using alfalfa as a wake up and nitrogen source for roses. However, and I think I can guess your answer just by the logo on your wall there. It wouldn't just be for roses. You can use this for a wide range of crops. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. We can use it for anything from vegetables to lawns, golf courses. The oil and gas industry uses it to help reclaim soils. Developers use it to boost soil after there's been some heavy maintenance. It really does put the life back into the soil, making it suitable for basically any type of plant life that you might have.
So I have another question here. It's one that's kind of touchy amongst YouTubers and so on, is that you hear about situations where animal feeds, particularly hay and straw and so on, have this herbicide residue. Now, you've already said that your farm is organic, but I thought we would just talk more generally a little bit about that issue of those persistent herbicides in hay and straw and so on. And that's not something that would really be an issue, certainly not on your farm because you're organic, but even with alfalfa in general, because those persistent herbicides would never be applied to the alfalfa field. Isn't that about right?
Well, on the north side of the border in Canada, it's specifically Western Canada, genetically modified alfalfa is not allowed. That's not the case in other parts of Canada, and it's certainly not the case in the US. Genetically modified alfalfa was developed strictly or solely for the benefit of removing any sort of competition for the alfalfa growing in the field. If there's no competition, the yield per acre would be higher. So those genetically modified alfalfa is made that way specifically so that it can be sprayed with glyphosate or other types of herbicides. Or in Western Canada, even though we don't have to worry about any type of herbicide, it is very common for insecticides to be used in Western Canada. There are certain infestations that can happen. We've been fortunate enough here in our area that we've never experienced it, but there are it is quite common that insecticides would be used on the alfalfa. There are very few alfalfa pellet producers left in Canada. Most of them are producing alfalfa solely for feed. Our company does both. We have a feed division and we have our fertilizer division. The big difference being the size of the pellet, whether it's pellet or meal, and also the timing of the cut for when we process the alfalfa. If we take it from the field very early in the flower stage, what that does is it ensures a higher protein level, and the higher protein equates to higher nitrogen. So as our fields are growing, we go in and we take a fresh cut, we bring it in. It has the high protein that gives us our fertilizer pellet. And then as the field continues to mature, it will eventually become a quality that would be used as a 1/4-inch feed pellet, which we sell all across Canada and North America.
Okay, so what I'm getting from you there is that if you are dealing with alfalfa that, say, didn't come from you, there could be both insecticide or herbicide residue. And the herbicide we'd be talking about in that case would be something like Roundup or glyphosate, not those long-term persistent herbicides I was talking about that usually are used on hay or straw crops, but still of concern. So the customer should still be buyer beware about a source that is organic, non-GMO, so that they can be sure that they're not getting those herbicide and pesticide residues.
Absolutely. And another thing that sometimes will crop up, if the pellets are produced specifically for export through the Asian markets, often they will contain all, in addition to pesticides, it's a synthetic binder that's added, and it also stabilizes the vitamin A, which is needed for export. So not all alfalfa pellets are created equal.
Makes sense. I want to talk about one other thing, and I won't hold you forever here, but one of the questions I get from people who are, again, rose people, they love to say the term triacontanol. It's like a growth hormone, and I hear it's present in alfalfa. It's been associated in research, although not that they've really pinned it down to a certain application level, but it's been associated with branching and basal breaks in roses. Is that something that you could comment on?
Absolutely. So you're absolutely correct. Tricontanol is a growth hormone, and it does stimulate branching. So it makes the alfalfa an excellent fertilizer for plants such grapes, lawns, anything where you want a lot of the branching or flowers or buds. Where we find that some of the studies that we've done have shown that on lawns, the amount of cuttings, even though the grass is not taller than using the conventional fertilizers we see on TV, the mass of the cuttings is much denser, much heavier, which indicates that there's more branching. The grass isn't as tall, but it's more dense.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time with me today. I should actually finish up here by saying a couple of things about your company. We've already talked about you guys being, organic and non-GMO, but you actually offer this both to the home gardener under the brand Grow Anything Fertilizer or growanythingfert.ca. And you also offer, this is kind of interesting. I mean, people don't tend to think about this, but you do it in big bulk applications. You already mentioned industrial applications, but agricultural application as well under the brand alfalfagreen.ca or alfalfa green. So I wanted to mention that quickly, is that you kind of cover the whole spectrum here. Anything else you want to say about Western Alfalfa Milling?
Sure. So we don't just grow alfalfa. We do have the acres that you mentioned, but what we do is we use alfalfa as part of our rotation. So any given year, we could have other organic crops growing as well. And any year we're taking on new acres with some of the local landowners here in Saskatchewan. So alfalfa is a way for us to include a crop rotation that improves the soil in between us growing other crops like oats, peas. Wheat is a big one that we will do. It just fits very nicely into our crop rotation as far as putting the nutrients back into the soil.
Well, after the main portion of our video call there, I stuck on the line with April for a few more minutes, and she brought up a great point that I hadn't thought to quiz her about while we were making the recorded portion of the video, and that's about weed seeds. And as you know, if you add compost, manure, straw, hay, mushroom manure, there's always a potential of weed seeds. There's also a potential of weed seeds when it comes to alfalfa pellets if you're using the type that's produced for animal feed. The difference between that and the stuff that they produce as a plant fertilizer in their mill is that they process it at high temperatures. That means they can leave out the binding agents that are usually used in the ones that have animal feeds, and it also actually neutralizes those weed seeds, so you don't have that problem in your garden. I think it's an important point, especially since we're talking to gardeners, that we don't introduce weed seeds. So that's one advantage of their product versus the alfalfa pellets that are typically produced as animal feed. All right, I want to thank April so much for taking the time to spend with me and you to discuss our concerns about using alfalfa as a fertilizer. And once again, if you have any questions, please drop those down in the comments below the video.